Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Peter, how's it going?
Very well. Excited to be here. It's still winter, coming winter. It's fall. It's a bit of both here in Ontario.
Yes, I did my first very cold, very hailstormy, snowy run yesterday, so I am not excited. But we are not here to bemoan the weather that's coming in later episodes.
In fact, we may have something you could do inside as we get into this sort of like early base preparatory period, maybe a new training intervention.
Yes, and let me tell you, as the spouse of someone doing this training intervention, it's not annoying at all.
Okay.
I'm actually not even sure if you're talking about breathing or heat training, because you are just all over the map.
It's the time to try kooky stuff. I think you want to introduce and try these new things so we don't do it during the race season and bring those new things into that specific period in the competition period. So this preparatory period is a time to start gradually into these other things we hope and wish and regret we didn't do in the past. So things like strength training, cross training, which I would include some of these accessory training methods such as respiratory training, which is what we're talking about today with Luke Way of Isokapnick. We've had Luke on before. Certainly you remember past episodes with Steve Neal as well, where we usually do mention respiratory training of some type. So you can go back and we will link to those, of course, in the show notes if you want to go deep on some of these previous episodes. But we do have Luke on today talking about Isokapnick and some of the stuff he's been working on with respiratory training and their device. And also sort of some tips about incorporating it into your work, because we do have some listeners and athletes we work with now who are using this. We had a couple who bought it off the first episode and then never used it. They never told me that they bought it. So we got them off of this episode. We've got them onto the beginner program that they offer free on their website and their app.
Nice. Now, can you kind of just describe what this device looks like for someone who's maybe picturing like a scuba setup?
Sure. Yeah, I usually let Luke describes it more nicely, I guess. Sometimes I'm just, you're sort of breathing into a balloon, right? There's a little handheld thing, a little apparatus, and that's sort of their proprietary, piece of the handle for the balloon. Really, it's this big balloon, a reusable balloon though. It's made I don't know if it's latex. It's probably not latex, but yeah, really that's what it is. If you just picture someone sitting down or standing up and they're sort of holding on to a large balloon, a 5-liter balloon in this case, so a pretty big balloon, and they breathe it up repeatedly for, when you start out, it's maybe 1 or 2 minutes at a time, maybe getting 10 minutes total. And then advanced people like Corey Wallace, who we talk about a fair bit in the podcast, the reigning 24-hour solo world champion for mountain bike many times over now. And, Leadville finisher multiple times over on a gravel bike this year as well. Not a mountain bike turned into a gravel bike, but a gravel bike, I think. So Corey is a big believer and user of this in these endurance events. So we talk a lot about that. But yeah, that's essentially the idea, is that you're going to sit there breathing into this balloon for about half an hour.
Now, do you find that this is also kind of an exercise in mindfulness, meditation, that kind of thing while you're doing it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's a few different ways we talk about, this could be a great warm-up, 5-minute warm-up before you get on your bike and start doing intervals or doing strength. It could be used in the recovery period, which is an area Luke's really interested in. And so you do your 3-minute hill repetition, maybe you run back down the hill or ride back down the hill, and then you breathe into this apparatus for maybe a minute. And then you go into another 3-minute interval. And so they're finding really interesting responses off of that because the respiratory muscles continue to work, similar to how you might do in a VO2 interval where you're breathing really heavy, but now you're not actually working. For the indoor trainer, again, this might be just a neat thing I always love these things that maybe they work, maybe they don't, but it's sort of tricking you into something novel and new, right? Where we take a recovery between any intervals, sweet spot intervals, and then breathe into it. And then you could also do it maybe as like a recovery modality as well, maybe even while injured or on a rest day, where your body, the rest of your body is resting a bit more. Your leg muscles aren't working, your arms aren't working if you're a rower or a strength trainer or whatever you're into. And then we can still continue to train the respiratory muscles, or at least move some blood and oxygen around the body. So it's really this like flexible thing that could be used in a lot of different ways. So yeah, I've always liked it, and it's something I used a lot in the past and try to keep cycling back in with it.
Love it. All right. Well, we should get into this episode with Luke, but before before we do, just a quick reminder that we actually do have a discount code now for
We should,
people,
because
right?
I don't know that Luke and I mentioned it. So I think it's Consummate Athlete 24. We'll put that in the show notes because consummate can be hard to spell sometimes. But yeah, that's the idea. So that'll get you a bit of a discount if you do want to try out isocapnic. And the great thing that we emphasize in the first episode and we mentioned in a bit is this has really brought down the price of respiratory training. It's something, again, I've done for, 15 years or something. But the original devices were, $1,000, $1,200. So it was a big investment in money and time for something that, is hard to fit into a day. And there's a lot of money, and time you could spend in different ways. Whereas this, I think, has brought it down where now this is cheaper than most things we're buying at, just around $200 plus or minus with depending on the promo code and so forth. So I think it's a worthwhile investment, especially for someone who's really pushing the limit, someone like Noah or someone who's like an advanced athlete with a lot of time. Or someone who maybe is like limited on when they can ride their bike, for whatever various reasons, right? The neighbors don't let you ride. You have a sleeping kid. You're traveling a lot. There's, I
was going to say, I could actually see that being really good for someone who's kind of consistently traveling for work and doesn't always have access to whether it's their own bike or hotel gyms. I mean, we've certainly been stranded in a lot of like airport hotels that don't have gyms and aren't in areas where you can run outdoors.
And Luke and I touched on this and we agreed to disagree that he's very into testing and I'm less into testing, but we should notice that like some people are limited by their respiratory system for a variety of reasons. Asthma would be an obvious one, but there's also like very otherwise fit people who have got to a point where the respiratory system could be a limiter in certain circumstances. We also talk a lot in this one about getting ready for something like Leadville, where respiration is very challenged for people coming from lowlanders for certainly. So it's something that's preparing your respiratory system for that eventual demand that's going to come in a way that you can't really do simply by riding your bike. So, we should mention that there's lots of reasons to do it. And I think now the excuse of it's too expensive is just not an excuse anymore.
Love it. Love it. So again, Consummate Athlete 24, definitely check out the show notes to get the link to isocapnic because also kind of hard to spell. So just a whole lot of confusing terminology here in order to get to this device. But head to the show notes. All right. Without further ado, enjoy this episode with Luke Way.
Happy to be back here with Luke Way talking respiratory training. We're talking about breathing into balloons, maybe slightly more complicated than that, but I'm happy to have you back, Luke. Thanks for coming.
Oh, thanks for having me back. Super stoked.
And now you've been all around the world, I think almost literally, chasing Corey Wallace on his 24-hour win, his 24-hour solo World Championships win, and a few other things. Do you want to tell us just where have you been as far as around the world?
Yeah. We just got back from a whirlwind trip down to Australia and New Zealand. Corey wanted me to be his pit boss for his sixth attempt at the World Championships, which now he's the six-time world champion, which is fantastic. So we were in Canberra for a little while he was racing that. But before that, we actually were able to make a stop over in New Zealand and hooked up with one of our affiliate coaches down there and was working with some of the All Black rugby players and some PGA golfers and really interesting testing results and very excited to see how we can help the rugby world with executing their sport.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Now, what would be, we have had you on before. We've talked several times on different podcasts about respiratory training, but maybe take us through, like, what would the All Blacks, for example, in rugby, what would they be doing with the respiratory training? Is this during the game or is this more out of the game or both, I guess?
Yeah, so the specifics of their program has been sworn to secrecy, of course, because it's very.
Well, you knew where I was going. Yeah, it's a secret.
is very cutthroat and secretive because it's very competitive. But basically, we identify strengths and limitations. We profile the athletes, and then we give them appropriate programs depending on their profile. For some of the key individuals, we'll go through like a full metabolic cart, similar to what we're used to in the endurance world, a little bit modified for their use case. And get a little bit deeper insights as to how we can best execute their training. But that's basically it. We give them a weekly program that they execute on, and then really some key workouts or protocols that they'll be using as warm-ups and recovery protocols and things like that.
Okay, so maybe then in line with that, like I know on the Isocapnic website you have a training program as part of your blog and sort of the website. But maybe just as a reminder for those that haven't checked out the previous episode with you, like just what is Isocapnic and I guess just a 101 of respiratory training.
Awesome. So Isocapnic is our company. Isocapnic is not a word that we invented. It's a scientific term that means to control or isolate CO2, and that's what our device does. That's how we are vastly different from really any other respiratory trainer on the market. Our device recaptures with what people are calling the balloon, but I'll call it a rebreather bag. And it recaptures your exhaled gases and stops you from hyperventilating. And so the easy way for people to understand this is like, if you were to take one deep, full breath, you could probably do that once or twice or 5 times without any ill effects. If you do that 10 or 15 or 100 times in a row, you're probably going to blow off all that CO2 that your body needs, and that's what we call hyperventilation. And so you blow off too much CO2, your system vasoconstricts down, and then you feel a little woozy if you go a little bit too far. So our device stops that from happening, and so it keeps your body normal capnic, keeps your CO2 levels safe and in the mid-range, and keeps your O2 levels, your oxygen levels, right at the tippy top of where they need to be. And that way we can train the range of motion, the total volume, the power, the endurance of that system without being bridled by hyperventilation. We can now train it specifically for 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes. If you're Corey Wallace, straight every day, he'll do a session that's about 30 minutes long.
Right. Okay. And so some people may have seen, on Amazon or something like that, like these things that are essentially straws with some resistance in them. And they indeed, as you say, they huff maybe 10 good huffs into it. But that's the limit of what they can do. Right. And then they probably do feel a little lightheaded, but it's limited there. So it's not, you can't train these muscles like we do our endurance muscles, like we do our quads or something when we go for a run or a bike.
Yeah, like I'm not going to say that resistive trainers, like trainers that just add some resistance to your breathing, are useless. But for most people, it's not what they need. For the vast majority of the people that have come through our lab, which is primarily athletes, it's not even sedentary people, but primarily athletes have really poor mechanics of how they're able to breathe. And so if you were to envision somebody going into a gym and they have really poor squatting mechanics, is a good trainer going to add resistance, add weight to somebody with poor mechanics? Of course not. That would just reinforce bad mechanics, and it would at best make them stronger at doing something poorly. And so what our device does is allow you to work on those mechanics, get really good range of motion, and then through that you actually get the resistive training that you need. You get the power and endurance required to like truly train that system.
Okay. I love it. And like you say, I guess the nice thing about your product as well is that, this is something that can be done watching TV. It can be done. I used to always do it when someone was driving the car. I didn't do it while driving, just to be clear, but while someone else was, we're driving somewhere. So I always felt like it was a nice additive to training, where something like strength training, some of this stuff, like you have to be in the spot to do the thing.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Like one of my favorite times to do my breatheway work is while I'm rolling out or stretching. And you can totally pair these things up, if you're going to be, answering emails in the morning or stretching or doing your core work or, doing like, any number of tasks. It totally pairs up with those items. So it really doesn't add anything to your daily commitment level in terms of time. It works perfectly with what you're already doing.
Okay, well, you mentioned Corey, and so Corey's someone I've tried to race against several times over. We've sort of, our careers have gone parallel, but as he does, he continued to endure in his career while I sort of was like, this is getting hard, and I'm going to just talk about this stuff now. So what you said he does, maybe 30 minutes, many days of the week or plus or minus, but what would, you don't have to share his secrets, but like what would an elite level, the cream of the crop all the time in the world, what would that type of program look like, on average? I know it's a tough question because the season changes and stuff, but when they're doing it, what does it look like?
Yeah. Well, the fun thing about Corey is that his season is always on. That guy is either training or racing. There's no off season for him. I think he's up north cutting down trees, getting in some base miles, and then he's back off to Nepal to do his altitude work, where he'll be there for a few months. But yeah, he basically does 6 sessions primarily a week. He might do one day off during the week, and each one of those sessions is 30 minutes long. And each session will vary in focus, from working on his tidal volumes to working on his breath frequency to give him a bit more strength and power. He also uses the device in between of interval sessions to help make his intervals a little bit better. Funny story with this is that we've been doing isocapnic work during interval sessions for years. It seems like a decade now. And now that it's starting to get more and more popularity, we have some researchers looking into the mechanisms behind what we're doing in those sessions. And our assumption was we're just adding extra respiratory load. We're just making it like a little harder for your respiratory system. So we're making a little bit more use of that time. That was the original goal of the session. Well, that we're doing that. But what they're also finding over control is that your interval performance gets better while doing breathway work between the sessions, between the intervals. And so, for example, let's say you're going to do a hill repeat workout. You do, 3 minutes, climbing up a hill. And as soon as you're done, you reach in your back pocket, you pull out your breathway, and you start, breathing away at 25 to 30 breaths per minute. And your lungs get a prolonged exposure to that CO2. They work a little bit harder. And then you take a little rest, and you start your next interval right away. And what we're finding is the working hypothesis as to why the intervals get better after doing this is that there's no vasoconstriction time between intervals. So normally you would go on, off, right? And so during your on, your body is charging up, producing ATP. That production of ATP dumps CO2 into your system, that vasodilates you out and supercharges how much blood flow is moving around your body. And then you rest. You blow off all that CO2, your body vasoconstricts back down to a more normal level. And then on the next interval, it has to recharge back up to a vasodilated level. And so with our device, what we're seeing is that people are actually able to maintain that primed state, that vasodilated state through the rest period. So when they start the next interval, they're starting already primed. They're starting already vasodilated, so they can actually deliver right from the get-go.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It occurred to me that this is a great time of year, sort of why we were back and forth. You were busy, and I was like, well, fall will be good, because I think a good time to get into this is the trainer season, right? You talked about a hill interval, so your device is great because it's pretty portable and you could bring it up the hill with you or whatever. But certainly when you're on your indoor trainer, it could be sitting beside you with all your snacks or whatever. And you could get off and, mix it up, right? I'm always keen on things that just make the indoor trainer a little different. We've always done getting off the trainer and do core exercise or, whatever, mix up your cardio machines. But this is really neat because it's another thing that maybe would get someone into it and using it, right? And then they can make it more complicated when they go out in the summer. In the hills.
Yeah. So to be clear with the way our device works is that it keeps you normal capnic while you're not moving. And so if you're going to use this on the trainer, you're going to spin away during your interval session. And as soon as you're done the interval session, you stop pedaling, you reach over, you can stay seated on your bike and throw the device in your mouth. And you do that, 25 to 30 breaths per minute for, 60 to 90 seconds while not moving on the bike. And your body's going to be a little bit higher level of CO2 because you just ended an interval session, and you get to sort of marinate in that extra CO2 a little bit longer than you otherwise would, and you get a really good response out of the respiratory system and a really great response out of that circulatory system in terms of helping you vasodilate. The word of caution is if you were to start using it while you're actually still spinning on the bike and exercising, it'll actually be more like altitude training. Because your body is absorbing more oxygen and producing more CO2, you would now be normalizing or controlling that state. And so then you'd actually hold on to a little bit more than you normally would. And that's going to cause a little bit of a different response. And that one is a little bit more advanced.
Right, right, and can get dangerous too.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend doing that without like having a coach or a practitioner in the room, just to monitor your pulse oximetry and make sure that you're being safe.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll maybe touch back in on the altitude in a second. To finish off, sort of like an elite level program. So we talked about 6 by 30 minutes. They're doing some
Yep.
high frequency. So it's sort of like when we do like spin ups or high cadence work on the bike, they're using sort of like shallower breaths or smaller
Yep.
breaths with higher frequency. They're breathing more often, and then they're also doing more, I guess, more standard like big breaths and slower
Yep.
frequency.
Yeah.
And then you
Yep.
said also some sessions where they're doing it as recovery between intervals on the bike. And then would there be anything else that would make up sort of that bread and butter week of someone who's like using it frequently?
Yeah, I mean, you know me, like I'm all about like objectively testing and understanding how progress is going, and so I always throw a step test in there at the beginning of the week. And so the step test is very simple. With our device, you start off at like 15 breaths per minute, and every 30 seconds you go up by 3 breaths per minute, until you start losing the ability to hold the maximum volume of your lungs, right? At a certain point, the frequency gets too fast and you have to start breathing smaller. And we want to like sort of monitor at what point that happens. You know, for some people, it's 30 breaths per minute. For Corey, it might be closer to like 50 breaths per minute. And so we want to sort of monitor where that is week to week. It's a great standalone workout on it, on its own. It's about 15, 20 minutes long, maybe if you're on there for long enough. And yeah, it just gives you a really good idea of at what point, at what frequency you start to like break down your respiratory system.
And is the when you're breaking down, you're not filling the bag as much?
Yeah.
Is it sort of visual, or what would be the indicator that you're starting to
Yeah,
fall apart? Or is it obvious when it happens?
Yeah, once you've done it a couple times, it's obvious when you can no longer hit the same volumes. For new athletes that haven't done it before, what I'll actually do is I'll put a sandwich bag clip on their bag, at the volumes that I know that they can hold, right? Yeah. And so that way they're getting really like clear feedback of full, empty, and then at some point they won't be able to fill it or empty it as much.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, and that's the one thing that I do with the Spyro Tiger, which we won't talk a lot about that, but the older, more expensive device that I used in the past. I did like that. That was the nice thing about having different bags is you got that end feel of like it is full.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's nice to know that you could put a chip clip on it in the same way we used to. With those.
Yep. Yeah. Like the reason why Spyro Tiger required that is because you needed to actuate their magnetic valving system, and it was a bit clunky. And with our device, we don't have any of those moving parts. It's all just through fluid dynamics that it keeps you mixed. So no one needs more than the one bag, especially if you know how to clip it. The clipping is like literally just for the user to understand how their volumes are doing. Once you get that feel, you actually don't even need the clip anymore.
Gotcha. And we do talk a bit about that in the previous one, so we'll leave that as for folks if they want to go deep on the dynamics, as you say, as on the bag and how it all works. So that was for like the more elite. We have a ton of time. Now let's say we're a master. We don't have a ton of time. How have you integrated that perhaps in your own life? How does that fit in? Like, cause it is a trade-off. Like you could maybe jump on the trainer, but are you going to do 30 minutes of this or 30 minutes of, 30 minutes of strength training or 30 minutes, go to sleep.
Yeah.
How do you fit that? Like I believe in it, but it's just sort of like, where do you see that fitting and just sort of like that cost benefit or value, this versus that type. Perception.
Well, I mean, I can just point a stick at, thousands of people that their primary use case for our device is pairing it with something else. Like I said, emailing or, stretching or, watching TV or whatever. Like it pairs really well with other things. And so in terms of time commitment, there's really not a lot of argument there as to I don't have enough time, unless you don't have enough time to check your emails, then you might not have time for this. But if you have time to check your emails or in the morning, then this certainly pairs up with any of these rituals that we do during the week. Now, for most masters athletes that are pretty middle of the bell curve in terms of their respiratory system, will do great with just 3 sessions a week of like 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes max is pretty standard stuff.
Okay. And similar sort of they're doing it just for less time.
Yeah, so like the ideal week for that I would build is, like I said, I always want to start with a step test so we know where we're at. I have one workout that's focused on volume, so it's slower breath frequencies and primarily focusing on just trying to stretch out how big your respiratory system is and squeeze down and get a little bit more contractility at the bottom. And so one for volume and then another one for frequency and power. So instead of being at 20, 25 breaths per minute, we might push it at 35, 40 breaths per minute. And you're actually trying to move a good 70 to 90% of that total volume that you have, but under a little bit more haste, right? You're trying to do it a little bit harder than you otherwise would. The idea is that ventilation is the currency that we're after, right? We want to see more liters per minute, and we can meet those liters per minute by breathing bigger or breathing faster. And what we know from research is that breathing bigger to meet that demand without sacrificing that volume is always going to be more efficient for your body. We want big, deep breaths. And if you're able to have big, deep breaths and breathe them fast, then
So then maybe where we could go to next is maybe just telling me, we've talked about it. Okay, we have someone beginning, we have a master, we have an elite level. So that's a good covering of sort of the training. And I'll remind folks that once they get the device, you have an app and you have a website with lots of training that people can work through over many months, right?
And I think probably since we spoke last, the app is relaunched and actually has a lot of these workouts built straight into it. Okay. And so there are 3 full training programs from very basic to intermediate that are free, that are on the app right now, that anybody can go on and check out.
Okay, that's awesome. Now, if someone, you said to intermediate, so now if someone was maybe, has gone through that, they've gone through the intermediate, it's pretty good. Is that when they're you need to go look into some testing and see someone like yourself to see what would be, the most effective use of time with this device? Is that, if you could become a Corey type person, or do you feel like that intermediate is probably what most people would just continue to do?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that, and the more variety of people in sports that I test, the more it's very apparent that the vast majority of people are pretty poor at breathing in terms of mechanics and ability. And so there's a lot of meat on the table. There's a lot of potential there by just doing some breath work. So don't feel like you have to get testing done to understand the value and whether or not you can see benefit from this. Worst case scenario is we just make a well-developed respiratory system, a little bit more resilient, a little bit stronger. But if you're in that 3/4 or more of the population that not only needs this, but they're governed by this, it's going to be a total game changer in terms of your output.
It almost strikes me that the analogy would be we do strength training. Everyone goes to the same squat rack, and you put on a couple more plates than I put on, and we're still both going to the squat rack 3 times a week or whatever it is. And the same equipment and the same protocol could work for both of us. You put on a couple more plates. So this would be you breathe a little deeper, a little faster. So it's probably, and then like you say, some people might need to go see a physiotherapist because they have something weird with their hip or something.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Now, when I'm working with like elite level athletes like Corey or athletes from the NRL or NHL or anything like that, we tend to do at least spirometry to understand, how big their lungs are compared to how big they are, and bell curve them to understand whether they're statistically well developed or not. And so from there we can get a little bit more specific with what we recommend for them to do.
Okay. All right. Maybe touch here on altitude and anything. Again, you can caveat everything that like some of this gets elite and they should talk to someone, consult with you even before they get to, and just because there is some danger of, getting too deep on the CO2 side and everything else low. But if someone was getting ready for Leadville, I know Corey also did Leadville. I waved at him. We were running by and he was suffering at mile 75 or 80. I don't know if he knew who I was, but I told him that he was doing great. How could we get ready for altitudes? If we can't go to a training camp, we can't get an altitude tent. We could do those things in combination. But like, let's say this is our main strategy. We're going to buy this $200 device. How can we best use it to prepare for something like Leadville?
Awesome. So when we're going to altitude, or you're going to be competing at altitude, there's two primary things that need to happen for us to do a little bit better there. One of them is when we go to altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen in the air around you is lower. And so you need to breathe more volumes to be able to get enough oxygen in. And so you need to have a fit enough respiratory system to be able to sustain that. So doing just regular breath training with our device is going to help build that strength and endurance required to just so a good example would be like at a sea level altitude, and if you're going sub-maximal steady state, you might be breathing at 25 breaths per minute to keep up with the demand. At that exact same output up at altitude, you might be breathing closer to 35 to 40 breaths per minute to get the exact same amount of air or fresh oxygen into your system. And so if you're not used to breathing that hard, if you're not fit enough to breathe that hard, then mechanically you're limited. Your lungs will get tired. We could talk about the metabolic reflex and how that affects things down the road. But basically, if your respiratory system gets under stress, then it takes the resources away from your legs. So just from a mechanical standpoint, having the fitness in your respiratory system to be able to sustain breathing harder, longer.
Right.
That's number one.
Which is a great message. Just like fundamentals of this respiratory training is do the respiratory training. Yeah.
But like that's like, people don't understand like the difference of like, oh wow, I just feel bad up at altitude and I don't know why. It's because it's very hard for us to keep up with that demand. The body requires harder breathing when you're up there, and most people just don't train it because they're training. Again, my favorite adage is the body will always do whatever's easiest. So if you're training at low altitude and you're breathing at 25 breaths per minute, it's not going to get good miraculously at 40 breaths per minute if you never train it there. So it takes some training to get there. So that's number one, is the mechanics to breathe that hard up there. And then number two, complicated hematocrit, how well your body transports oxygen and is able to deal with that altitude exposure. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of the hypercapnia or hypoxic work that we can do with our device. So normally when you go to an altitude training camp or you go to a hyperbaric chamber or something like this, they're going to depressurize the oxygen in that environment, or you're going to be up at altitude and it's the same sort of thing. You can have a little bit less oxygen available to you. And what this ends up doing is makes it a little bit more difficult for you to breathe, and so you have to breathe harder. With our device, what we can end up doing is doing these intermittent intervals, essentially, of hypoxic, so low oxygen, and hypercapnic, high CO2, really challenging that hematocrit to do its thing. So when your body is exposed chronically to low oxygen levels, the body again will do whatever's easiest, and it recognizes that it needs more affinity to move oxygen because there's not as much of it. And so it starts producing more red blood cells so it can raft more of that oxygen that's available to the muscles that are working. That's how that hematocrit response works. CO2 is the same thing. If we can drive CO2 levels up and O2 levels down in a safe range, then your hematocrit's getting hit from both angles. Number one, the oxygen level's low, so it wants more red blood cells to raft that CO2, or sorry, that oxygen to the muscle. And then it's high CO2, so again, there's too much CO2 than what's normal, and so the body again wants more of that hematocrit, more of those rafts to ship that CO2 out of the system. And so that's why it gets hit from both angles here. And that's what the hypercapnic, hypoxic work that we can do with our device. That's why it's really effective in terms of altitude, conditioning.
Okay. And is it worth talking about protocol, or or do you want to say like, probably consult with someone to get one?
Yeah. I would probably talk with you offline so we could work with so you could work specifically
Sure.
with your clients. If
Some of
anybody
this
has
is a
questions,
specific
they're
request,
well.
so yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and honestly, it's not because it's secretive. It's more so because eye contact needs to be made. That people need to understand that more isn't better in this realm, right? And athletes are known for, well, if this is normal, I'm here, and they go a little
100%.
bit too hard, too fast, right?
Yeah.
And it's not about that. It's just about exposure and driving that stress load to just the point where we can ride that wave instead of getting smashed by it.
Exactly. Yeah. Do you recommend for this and just for normal, bread and butter routine of respiratory training, having an SpO2 fingertip monitor?
It's any stretch of the imagination for sure. If you're interested in monitoring it, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, especially if you're going to be using it in between intervals, it's kind of fun to see. There's like a small dip in oxygen as you're using it between intervals, and then it pops back up. Yeah, our device is so well calibrated that it's not required.
You wouldn't see it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. I guess the last thing that I was going to bug you about today was, having now been part of, certainly the build and stuff for many of these solo 24 hours and big, endurance events generally, but let's focus on the 24-hour, which we can probably do any of these relay style 8-hour races. Any, big things that you notice from the support standpoint being there, that you thought were like, secrets that Corey uses to be so good at these races, or that you found as a support staff, for people who are going to pursue these types of things?
I mean, like I mean, Corey and I go way back. Like he grew up like about 3 houses down from me in Jasper, and so we've just been friends for the longest time. But it's like I'm in the same boat as you. I raced him, way back when, and he handed me my hat back then, and he's even better now. And watching him in action over these past few years, there's always stiff competition, right? And you can never take away anything from the rest of the field that show up. But Corey has such a deep chest of tools to work with, right? When push comes to shove, he has the training and the volume, which most people have, right? Like most of those guys at that tippy top of the sport, they're getting a lot of that work done. But Corey's been doing it so long that he has his nutrition plan is diverse and on point, and so at no point is he like struggling to like get this or that type of mixture down. He's constantly switching from mixture to mixture to mixture throughout the entire race, depending on his intuition of how his body's feeling. So his feel of that is incredible. And I mean, yeah, watching other people struggle with that, like that's honestly one of the biggest challenges in a race long like that is you getting in the calories and being consistent with them, because the first thing to shut down is typically your gastro system.
Yeah.
So he just keeps that thing rolling. He keeps that like 80 calories an hour like rolling, or 80 grams of calories an hour.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you know, is it mostly in the sort of like liquid nutrition, or is he also mixing in solids?
He's done solids more in the past. This year was a lot of liquid nutrition, like very very strong mixtures of tea and things like that. I had avocados for him, and he picked away at them on occasion. Let's see. He was really loving jubes for a while. He ate a lot of like Harvest Valley granola bars.
Okay.
He probably had like an entire box of Harvest Valley granola bars.
Nice. The good old Costco special. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean,
Nothing
just
else?
like the nice thing about that is that like they're dry, yes, but they're also like they're absorbent, and so they make him feel a little more full when he eats.
Yeah,
them.
especially with that liquid. That's what they say. Like you end up with that sloshy gut sometimes.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Cool. Nothing else of note that you noticed, even people screwing up while you were there?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing by far is just that the depth, like the depth of knowledge, the depth of experience that he has is just you just watch people try to compete against it, and as soon as anybody shows any sign of like cracking, he's there to capitalize, and he will put a lap on you because you cracked.
Yeah. 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 That's what they say. A lot of the ultra stuff, running and otherwise, it's experience and like the gut. Like if you can keep your gut together, experience in the gut, and that like predicts so much of the performance, even like beyond like your thresholds or whatever you want to pick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Corey's super fun to test because if he comes in sort of after a hiatus, like after he comes back from chopping wood, he'll likely be, maybe 100 watts weaker than when I see him in the middle of the season. Like he has such a huge range for how much he lets his body sort of like just be baseline, and then he builds it up, and then he holds, like by race time, he's like quite happy at 400 watts all day.
Interesting. I always wonder if that's like, those people also like, they almost come in and try and be like a little lazy to start off with and not really push in the first tests too much. But I know you're also tracking physiological measures, I guess. But,
Yeah. I'm totally not pushing him to failure at all. We're looking to see at what point his oxygen consumption changes, and at what point his MOXY numbers change, and so we can pretty objectively see how efficient his system is. And it's cool to see. And part of that is that when he is not racing, he resorts back to really his strengths, which is just putting in low intensity volume. He's the king of your 38-hour workout week.
Bread and butter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we could chat all day about this, but I just wanted to put this back into people's minds and get them to ponder it. So if they did want to look into and order an isocapnic device, they can go to isocapnic.com. You're also on Instagram with lots of info there.
Yep.
If someone wanted to look into getting testing or something, they were out in BC out west, where would they look for you?
Yeah, so I'm based out of Kelowna, BC. You could look us up on our Isocapnic website, and just send us a message, and we'll set you up at our lab.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again for your time and for updating us on all things respiratory training, Luke.
All good. Thanks again for the invite.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.